It's John Kiefer here. I do a joint post over with my good friend Basshead4, Mark, on Dr. Rhythm. And I decided to do a few solo posts, largely because it's so difficult for me and Mark to get together at the moment. We will be doing another joint post in a few weeks' time, I hope. But in the meantime, I thought I was on my way home on the train tonight, and I was thinking about music, as I often am, and started thinking about how I first started getting into a lot of the more experimental jazz and improvised music in the UK. The music was all coming out on major record labels, and so I thought I'd do a little bit of a post about that and show some records and so forth. What I tend to do with these posts in general is to rather than doing recent finds, is to do slightly more kind of archaeological stuff and talk about kind of how I got into various areas of music and so forth. So I'm going to do some shouts at the end as well, lots of shouts, because a lot of people have inspired me on the VC. So I'm going to kick off and show some records. I'm going to start off with Michael Gibbs. This was his first record, which came out on the DRAM label, famous label for folk music, lots of kind of almost kind of psych folk and progressive rock and so forth, also kind of more mainstream kind of pop stuff as well. This was featuring his kind of big band come orchestra, and has all kinds of interesting musicians on here. Kenny Wheeler, Jack Bruce from Cream is on here as well. John Sermon is featured on this. He's featured on quite a few of the records I'm going to be showing actually. And this came out in 1970, I think, or maybe, yeah, 1970. One thing I really like about DRAM records is they have this little hole cut in them. So and they coloured the inner sleeve so you could see whether it was mono or stereo copy, which is kind of quite cool. So this is Mike Gibbs on DRAM. Has been reissued on actually a very well remastered CD, but the original vinyl is getting hard to find these days. So and probably cost you about 30 UK pounds, something like that. But it's a very good record. Mike Gibbs was very influenced by Gil Evans, and in fact he's got a new record out which has just come out, which is of him doing some versions of Gil Evans tunes, which is really, really good. It's only on CD, sadly. In fact, playing in the background is another one of Mike Gibbs' records, and I'm just playing it on CD because I haven't got a turntable in this room. And this is from his CD called Just Ahead, which is a live album, a very nice live album. I'll get rid of this glare if I can somehow or other. Okay. Next up is another big band from this kind of time, kind of orchestra, and this is Mike Westbrook, and this is his record called Citadel Room 315, and this came out on the RCA label. In fact, Mike Westbrook had previously had some stuff out on DRAM as well. And this is another record that features John Sermon. Kind of interesting, kind of. Mike Westbrook obviously went on to do a lot of work on Hat Hut Records. Some interesting work over there. Also had a small group which was almost like a kind of marching band for a while. This is again featuring some of the same musicians, featuring Kenny Wheeler, a whole range of, in a sense, some of the people are almost like the usual suspects from this time of UK jazz. Again, like I don't think this has been reissued on CD, but it's not been reissued on vinyl. And again, kind of getting harder to find, probably about 30 or 40 pounds, I guess, in terms of in UK pounds, in terms of finding this on. Good record, worth tracking down, recommended. Next up is a bit of a weird one. This is a record by a guy called Bob Downs, who's a flautist. This is called Deep Down Heavy. And this actually came out on Music for Pleasure, which in the UK was kind of like a budget label, almost kind of putting out things like lots of cheap compilations and kind of almost like sound-alike records. Very, very cheesy cover indeed, actually. This is interesting because it features Harry Miller, who was one of the exiled South Africans working in London. He plays bass guitar in here, but also two guitarists. Chris Spedding, who went on to work with Nucleus, who I may well talk about in a future post sometime, and also Ray Russell, who's somebody else I will get back to at a different time as well. It's kind of, I wouldn't go any way, kill yourself to find this actually. It's kind of, you can see my copy's fairly beaten up here. It's kind of almost like kind of psychedelic jazz rock, I guess, actually, with some slightly dodgy kind of lyrics on it as well. Chris Spedding, interesting, I mean, also kind of ended up working with the Sex Pistols, of course, and actually plays on quite a few Sex Pistols tracks uncredited, actually, as well. A collection there. Just sort this glare out of it. Okay. Next up, and this has been shown, I think, definitely by John Coltrane 68 and others as well. This is another John Sermon record. This is a record by him, actually, which is called Morning Glory, which was a great band called with John Sermon, John Marshall, Terry Ripdahl, Chris Lawrence, John Taylor, and Malcolm Griffiths. This came out on Virgin, actually. It came out on Island Records. And I'm certain that Chris was raving about it, and I certainly kind of add my weight to that. Whereas it came out in gatefold sleeve. It shouldn't be too hard to find this one, actually. I mean, there's kind of copies of this knocking around still. So that's John Sermon's Morning Glory. I think that's also early 70s. 73 this one came out on Island Records. Next up, this one is harder to find, certainly on the original vinyl. I've talked quite a lot at different times on blogs and so forth about how influential the whole kind of South African scene was when it came to the UK. Those musicians, when they turned up in London, I was lucky enough and old enough to be able to hear a lot of them play. I mean, they made such an impact. It was just the music they were playing was very, very. They blended incredibly well with the British jazz musicians around at the time, but the music they were playing was so different, really, to that which we were used to. Much more fiery in a sense, and more kind of obviously influenced by their kind of South African roots. The first record that Chris McGregor put out in the UK, at least, was actually on Polydor Records, and this was the Chris McGregor Sextet. It came out on Polydor, as I just said. It was produced by Joe Boyd, interestingly enough, who, of course, produced people like Nick Drake and Fairport Convention, and a lot of those artists around that same time. He also wrote a great book called, which is kind of like his memoirs, which is called White Bicycles, which I really recommend, actually. This record features basically the Blue Notes. It has Mongezi Feza, Dudu Pukwana, Johnny Diani on bass, Louis Maholo on drums, and also a tenor saxophone player who kind of, I think, went to Europe and kind of disappeared off the scene a bit. He was called Ronnie Beer. It's a very, very nice record, and the first track, Marry You My Dear, is an absolutely beautiful track. You can really hear the seeds here of a lot of Brotherhood of Brest style as well later on, even though it's a much, much smaller group. This was re-released on CD, I think, as well, but it's pretty hard to find on vinyl and may cost you a bit if you're interested in it. Next up, and now we're going a bit more kind of left field, really. There are kind of two schools. Well, a lot of people talk about two schools of early improvised music in the UK. One of which was the AMM school, with people like Cornelius Cardew and John Tilbury and so forth, and the other school, which was spontaneous music ensemble. I think Anders talked about Carrie Obin in one of his very early posts, the Spontaneous Music Ensemble record, which came out on a major label, of course. So I won't talk about that, but I will talk about AMM. This was their first release, actually, and it came out on Elektra Records, of all places, which was at that point putting out people like The Doors and Judy Collins and stuff like that. I think it was actually recorded by Jack Holtzman, who was the owner and founder of Elektra Records. This is actually a mono copy, very beaten up. I actually bought this when I was about 16 or 17, actually, although the vinyl was in good condition, but the cover's pretty mashed, actually, I must admit. I spent a lot of time playing this record trying to work out exactly what was going on with it as well. Completely incongruous when it came out. It was a very unusual kind of release for Elektra to make. And I guess one of the formative records of improvised music in the UK. The group at that point was Cornelius Cardew, Eddie Prevost on drums, Keith Rowe on guitar, prepared guitar, and all kinds of effects and so forth, although they were mostly kind of self-made effects. Lawrence Schaaf on cello, and Lou Gare on tenor saxophone. Now Mark, Basshead 4, actually played with Lou Gare a few weeks ago in a kind of, not a public session, but a bit of private improvisation a few weeks ago. So AMM music, kind of classic. This is very expensive to find, actually, in its original form. Although there have been various reissues of it on CD, I don't think on vinyl and so forth. Although I don't think my copy will fetch all that much money. You can just take the covers in, yeah, I mean, you're talking probably £500 or something like that for this record. But if you get it in a reissued form, it's great, really worth a listen to. Kind of formative stuff. Next up, and similarly, kind of surprisingly, really, Tony Oxley, who's a drummer and percussionist, most recently working with people like, been working for a long time now with Cecil Taylor and so forth as well. He was one of the people who were involved with the London Musicians Collective, which was a cooperative rather, which was one of the kind of groupings of improvising musicians at the time. And Tony Oxley ended up getting 3 records released on major labels somehow or other. The first of these was the Baptized Traveller, which was his quintet, which was on the CBS Realm Jazz label, which was a green label CBS records. They were a series which was a kind of, I'm not sure whether they were kind of bargain price or what actually, but they were definitely around at that time. Also Ray Russell, who I'll talk about probably in another post, actually had some stuff out on that label as well. So that's Tony Oxley. The group at that point was yet again Kenny Wheeler involved with this. Derek Bailey, one of the first times I ever heard Derek Bailey was on this record. Jeff Klein and Tony Oxley. The music was still coming out of jazz. Tony Oxley was still playing a fairly traditional kind of kit at this point. Hadn't yet kind of done some of the embellishments that I'll talk about later on. And there are compositions, although there's a lot of improvisation in here, the compositions are still just about recognisable as kind of, I suppose, kind of left field contemporary jazz, really. So that's Tony Oxley, that's a Baptized Traveller on CBS Realm Jazz. The next release by Tony Oxley was on the main CBS label, and it was his sextet, before Compositions for Sextet. And here we're talking about the same group as the Baptized Traveller, but with the addition of Paul Rutherford on trombone. I think you might have lost me for a minute anyway, so I don't know what happened on my screen then. So it's the same group as the last one, with the addition of Paul Rutherford on trombone. Again, you can hear that there are compositions in place on this, but they're starting to get more and more kind of minimal and a lot more improvisation. Yet again, kind of, I think I got this before I got Baptized Traveller, so this is probably lying a bit by saying I think this was the first time I heard Derek Bailey, not the Baptized Traveller. Kind of good record, quite surprising to see on the kind of main CBS kind of label. Now you would have thought the majors would have learned, really. I can't imagine they shifted huge amounts of copies of the first 2 Tony Oxley records, but after he left Seaboard, I don't think he was contracted to CBS, I'm not sure how it works, but he then went to RCA, and the record came out on RCA, and this is called Ichnos. This has got a great cover. You can see Tony Oxley's extended kit on this cover, all the bits he put in place on top of it. He also started using kind of electronics on the kit and amplifying at this point as well. I'm just going to shift the camera around a bit. And you can see all his kind of various, obviously non-traditional drums, a washboard in there, I think, as well, a film reel, and a giant cowbell, which he still, I think, was using quite recently with Cecil Taylor. So this one has solo percussion tracks, it also has quartet tracks, and it also has some sextet compositions. Now the compositions are getting more and more minimal, and they're almost like kind of cues rather than 3 composed pieces. This has the same group as the last one, but with the addition of Barry Guy, or the substitution of Barry Guy for Jeff Klein. At this point, Barry Guy started using electronics on his double bass as well. I'll talk more about Barry Guy when I start talking about some of the independent labels as well in another post in the future. So the Ichnos, this has never been re-released, I think, so it's only, I might be wrong, but I think the only edition of this is original vinyl, and is probably pretty pricey, I guess, as well. So that's Ichnos, Tony Oxley. Next up, only 2 more to go. I'm going to try and keep this post quite short, actually. Next up, quite surprisingly, really, there was Fred Frith had a solo guitar record out on Caroline, which was a subsidiary of Virgin. In fact, I think Caroline went on to have some kind of relationship with the distribution company in the States. I think that was part of the deal with EMI when Virgin sold out to EMI in the States. And this is the second one in the series, which is Guitar Solos 2, which features Fred, but also features, if I get a bit closer, you can really see the cover there. Also features Derek Bailey. I think it was a lot of people's first time of hearing Derek Bailey. Also features the German guitarist Hans Reichel, who sadly died a few years ago. Very interesting guitarist, nice kind of improviser. And a guy called Jerry Fitzgerald, who played quite a lot with Lowell Coxhill around this time. And each of them have 3 or 4 pieces. Well, I think Jerry only has 1 piece. Each of them have 3 or 4 pieces on the record. Pretty widely distributed this. There were a lot of copies around, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. But it's I mean, I think all the guitarists are very interesting. It's kind of interesting to hear what improvised guitar sounded like back in the 70s. And this came out in, don't know when actually. I think it was kind of probably 73, 74, something like that. That's Guitar Solos 2. And finally, before the shouts and other stuff, this record came out on, I know people have shown other possibly even this one actually, from Brian Eno's Obscure label. And this is a really important kind of initiative. It's a lot of music was heard for the first time on this label. Brian Eno basically did a I suppose this little subsidiary of Island Records called Obscure, which featured a lot of music for the first time. This one featured 2 of the slightly younger improvising musicians and also kind of sound artists really, David Toop and Max Eastley. David's a hugely influential figure on the whole scene. His writing as well as his music is massively important, I think. Actually, it certainly changed a lot of the way I think about music. So I'll talk more about David, I think, definitely in a future post. This is called New and Rediscovered Instruments, and there was a little book that came out, published by David at the same time, which I was trying to find, but it's buried somewhere in the vaults, and I couldn't dig it out for this post, but I'll try maybe in the future. This mostly features made and constructed instruments. David's instruments are played on here, but Max's instruments are largely kind of aeolian. They're powered by wind, water, and so forth as well. It's kind of a very interesting record. It has been reissued on CD, I think, but not on vinyl. But it's fairly easy to find. Shouldn't cost you too much money, this one as well. This is David Toop and Max Eastley, New and Rediscovered Instruments. Now, there was a lot of magazines around at the same time as some of this music came out, and I'll talk more about the magazines when I get on to talking about, in a future post, some of the labels. I'll talk about Incus, and I'll talk about FMP Records in Germany and ICP, which I know people are into, and I'll show some of the stuff that hasn't been shown already on the VC from them. There is quite an interesting book that came out in the UK. Not terribly what it could do with a kind of, it was, I think, not particularly kind of major scale budget around this book. I mean, it could do with some editing and there's some proofreading issues in places, but it's by a guy called John Wicks, and it's called Innovations in Jazz, and it's about British innovations in British jazz. And it's volume 1, but there never, as far as I know, has been a volume 2. And it covers, I mean, it's a 350-page book. There's quite a lot of it. Certainly, if you're interested in who played with who during this time, all the various kind of groupings, covers the whole kind of South African presence in London pretty well around this time as well. Definitely worth getting. I think it's still available, actually. I mean, if you go to the FMR, as opposed to FMP Records, the FMR label site, who've been an independent label putting out improvised music in the UK for quite a long time, they have a book section there, and they publish the book. It's really worth it. It's packed with information and quite interesting in places as well. There are kind of lots of record covers and actually concert posters and so forth in there as well. In fact, there's one of the records I've just played actually, is the Mike Westbrook record, just shown on the same page. That's it. So it's been worth a look actually, and as a reference book, it's quite useful. Okay, finally some shouts really, and lots of shouts in fact. As I said right at the beginning, I mean the VC, I think it's been a great thing, great initiative. The whole thing's been very exciting. People showing some great music. Started with Roger Coleman, who I've been following as a blogger for a very long time on his excellent New Void blog. It's great to see you on the VC, Roger. I think you're a really great addition to the whole thing. Blake, I mean, I've loved what you've been doing particularly in terms of talking about contemporary classical music, focusing on the Opus 1 label and other stuff, and I'll certainly be doing something about that at some point or other in the future. Anders in Stockholm. Anders, great to meet you in London a couple of weeks ago. It was a really delightful meeting. Yeah, thanks for the record and everything else. I think I did the I think I did the VCLT somewhere else actually, but that was beautiful actually. And yeah, really lovely to see you, and great to meet your brother as well. Chris Basket, fantastic. Continue, always interesting. I mean, your videos are always interesting. There's always something in there I've never heard of. Love the way you talk about the music. Um, Derek, of course, absolutely kind of classic stuff. And I also love all Derek's comments about stuff apart from music as well. I think it's really, he's really an excellent kind of broadcaster, really. And we're lucky to have him. Mr. Fartboy, fatbackfunk, fun. Great to see you back. With also good to see Hammond again as well. Very funny. That last post was just hilarious. I just loved it. John Coltrane 68, I mean, just constantly, absolutely amazing range of stuff you talk about. Just really superb, really interesting. Revitalised my whole kind of interest in whole areas of, I think, kind of spiritual jazz, which has been a big thing for me over the last few weeks. Again, going back and rediscovering some of that stuff. Andrew Lovell Andrew, Big Star 1000, Steffi Vaughan, Mike, Boston. I wasn't called Boston Reggae, but it's Boston Reggie, of course. Actually, in fact, your last your thank you to John Coltrane says yes, it's going to be the basis of one of my future posts as well about JCOA records. And Daryl Washington, I love your post, Daryl. I mean, talking about CDs, it is in the end all about the music. So thanks everybody. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed it, leave some comments behind, and I'll either see you back here or I'll see you back with Dr. Rhythm in a few weeks' time. Thanks and good night. Lots of love to everyone.